Welcome to another edition of USISPF's Indo-Pacific Security Dialogues. These are our monthly panel discussions where we have experts from think tankers, journalists, academics, former government officials now in the private sector to discuss all things Indo-Pacific. And you're about to see with my list of three-star panelists, they epitomize all of this, the academics, former policy officials, think tankers, and just expertise all around. Who would have thought that last month we'd be discussing this topic this month? Because while India and Pakistan have been in the crosshairs for nearly 8 decades since they were carved out of partition from the British Raj, the four wars, including the first war of Kashmir of 47-48, but the recent conflagration in South Asia has sort of brought back the fears of the last 2.5, 3 decades. The inherent dangers when two nuclear adversaries sort of square off. And the picturesque Pahalgam region in Jammu and Kashmir, where innocent tourists and civilians tragically lost their lives on April 22nd. As per official counts, 25 Indian civilians and one Nepali citizen. And then the Indian military on May 7th carried out Operation Sindoor, targeted missile strikes in 9 targets in Pakistan and the part of Kashmir held by Pakistan, targeting terror groups that receive patronage from the mill establishment and the Pakistani, certain section of the Pakistani state. Now, as the conflict escalated, both militaries claimed to have hit targets across the border, both claimed to have hit opposition aircrafts. And of course, a reluctant Washington, which initially said it didn't want to do anything with it, stepped in to announce that they had brokered a ceasefire and New Delhi and Islamabad had dialed down the temperatures. And we sort of have what I like to call hot peace, what I'd like to get into a little more. But to make sense of this madness right now and the most recent skirmish, I am delighted to kind of have the expert panel put out right now. My very inimitable colleague Vikram Singh, who's always has the best insights, senior advisor defense and aerospace here at USISPF, joined by first timers on this webinar, Michael Rubin, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute AEI, and Trisha Bacon, who's now professor justice law and criminology at American universities. Congratulations, Trisha, on that promotion. And I'm Akshab Girdas at USISPF. And just before I kick things off, housekeeping rules. These conversations are being recorded and will be available later on USISPF's YouTube platform. So if you do have to dash out, don't worry. Their expertise will live on the internet, so you can come back and visit it later. And as I get started, if you have questions, please put your name and affiliation in the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the limited time. So welcome to Michael, Trisha, and Vikram. Thank you all for being here. Vikram, I want to get started with you, all right? You've seen India for a long time. And just before April 2nd, the big T word that we're worrying about were tariffs, after President Trump's announcement at the Rose Garden. But it goes to show that no matter what we do, we can't forget the age-old threat of terrorism. Even if it's not present immediately, it still lingers. And particularly in the Indian subcontinent, since the bloody partition in 47, we've been stuck in this morass of 4 wars, multiple skirmishes, nuclear saber rattling. This adds another chapter to the thorny relationship. So in some ways, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does always rhyme.
Yeah, thanks, Akshob and Michael, Trisha. It's really delightful. I wish we were all doing this in person, but it's great to see both of you. Yeah, I think everyone was really caught by surprise by the Pahalgam attack, and not just by the fact that there was an attack in Kashmir. This is something that happens, but there's been a fairly durable ceasefire along the line of control since 2021. And, despite all the changes and the controversy around the changes in the autonomous status of Kashmir and the governance of Kashmir, basically Indian Kashmir has been seeing a surge in tourism and development and activity, and had been really shown to be quite a success story, which is probably part of what was motivating terrorists to try to shake things up and basically say, hey, India, not so fast. You can't just normalize things in Kashmir. This is still a dispute, and we're gonna show you. But what they did is they showed it in an extraordinarily brutal way. This was not an attack on military targets. This was the singling out of tourists. Hindu males were pulled away from their families in this, as you said, beautiful place that they had come to visit, and massacred in front of their families, purely based on their religion. And I think it's been a little bit underappreciated how big a psychological impact that has. It feels October 7th like, if you're in Indian, right? It's like this level of brutality and cruelty really sparked a level of outrage that was bound to see an Indian response. And I think we're also seeing the evolution, as you were talking about, it rhymes. It's the evolution of India's responses. India has gone from generally not responding to up through, in 2019, conventional responses, but in a fairly limited way, right? On basically symbolic, basically saying we're willing to cross into Pakistani airspace and cross into Pakistani territory and counterstrikes in response to terrorism, to this time saying, okay, we're actually going to go after the militant infrastructure. And so I think the nature of the terrorist attack is sort of part and parcel for the things we might expect here, and the nature of the response is also. But on both ends, they escalated. They were more inflammatory, more dramatic, and the Indian response, I think, was very clearly calibrated. That first day, they only hit terrorist infrastructure, known locations where training and leadership of groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed are based. And then it was sort of wait and see what happens after that. So, I think it is another step in this protracted conflict, but I think we're at a point now where, on the Indian side at least, the era of let's try to get back to talks, let's try to have a process, is really giving way to, like, let's see when Pakistan decides it's not going to support or even tolerate extremists conducting attacks from Pakistani soil into India. And I think one of the key distinctions here is that for the Indians, it doesn't matter if it's ISI directly controlling, ISI implicitly backing, or ISI simply not doing any, or the Pakistani state simply not doing anything about the extremist groups in Pakistan. They have now said it's all a parcel, whether you're, running the thing from headquarters in the military, or you're just ignoring the fact that people like Hafiz Saeed are living freely and going about their business and happily sponsoring extremists to go across the border. India is treating it as something for which the Pakistani state is culpable.
Yeah, absolutely. And Vikram, to your point, that's, the fact that India sort of had said enough is enough. And I wanted to get to later to speak to you about the era of restraint, what Shiv Shankar Menon wrote about in his book Choices. But before I do that, I want to get to you, Michael, next. I mean, I was reading what you recently wrote in an article where you said, talking about defense procurement, defense sales, and about Washington's defense sales to India. You said, with Russia bogged down in Ukraine, Moscow defaulted on several billions of dollars in defense delivery to India on aircraft, engines, and weaponry. One reason why India used French-built Rafale fighters to great effect in recent conflict with Pakistan is that it lacks supplies and support for its Russian-built platforms. So you go on to add, in the long term, India will further develop its own industry. And I found this very interesting because it's not just about India's indigenization of defense industry. You perhaps may have said where Washington perhaps missed a chance to increase some of those defense sales to India, because we saw S-400s being used, Rafale jets being used. So from the February meeting that where Prime Minister Modi and President Trump met, and I think loosely F-35s were mentioned by President Trump, where was there a chance of Washington trying to further increase defense sales, and perhaps the reason why the United States India defense partnership is equally important at this time?
Well, absolutely. Look, first of all, when it comes to weapon sales, it's important to remember weapon sales aren't simply about weapons. They're about cementing a decades-long relationship of training, of maintenance, and so forth. They really symbolically tie countries together. The United States has also come to understand across multiple administrations that India doesn't want to put all of its eggs in one basket when it comes to supply. And at first, we oppose this. We worry about leakage of technology, but India has been able to convince us that there has been no technology leakage from Western technology to Russian to any other technology that India might use. Now, we did have a great opportunity, but I use the past tense here because when Donald Trump talks openly about weaponizing trade and about using trade to pressure India and Pakistan into a ceasefire, and when he imbues this comment with moral equivalence. It really is a wake-up call to many in India asking, can we really invest billions of dollars into US defense industry for top-end platforms when we could have our ability to use those severely constrained, where we could have our supply chain shut down because of the political whims of this president or that president in the future. And so ultimately, Donald Trump has a habit of speaking off the cuff. He doesn't always think about the long-term ramifications of what he says. In this case, I believe that he's actually undermined a great opportunity to tie the world's largest democracy with the United States to help define the security partnership for the 21st century.
Absolutely. And I think,
if I could just jump in there, one of the things I think certainly in the Indian media, it is, it's really giving grist to the mill to the critics of the U.S. India partnership. Yep. I think to your point, Michael, though, the habit of speaking off the cuff, I think, Indian officials are viewing this more as speaking off the cuff. And hopefully, in the final analysis, I mean, one of the things you see here, in India's initial foray, the lack of fighters with any stealth. Rafale is not a stealthy fighter, and let alone the older platforms. And in the area of integrated air and missile defense, electronic warfare, ISR, there's a whole bunch of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. There's a whole bunch of areas where U.S. technology could be extremely beneficial to India. So I think the hope is that this is a momentary ripple rather than what it could be. And Michael, I think you're right. If it keeps going, especially if there's a lot of talk of mediating on Kashmir, which the Indians absolutely reject any third-party mediation in their disputes with Pakistan, beyond like a tactical ceasefire thing. I think that's a different kind of engagement. And I think that could really harm strategic ties for a period of time.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, if I could just add to that another dynamic, I agree with you, Vikram. As an outside analyst and as someone who doesn't normally delve into Indian politics, one thing that Indians can be proud of is when the crisis erupted after the Pahalgam terrorist attack, India's democracy showed how mature it was, with the opposition joining with the government for a common national goal and common national defense. But that's not going to continue forever. And what I worry about from the United States perspective, with the tin ear of some of the statements coming out of Washington, is that we're giving fodder to the Indian political debate so that those who, while everyone rallied around Prime Minister Modi in his defense, this gives an opportunity for some of the opposition to try to outflank Prime Minister Modi on the nationalist side. It's just something that oftentimes Washington forgets. When we're dealing with other democracies, we actually have to be cognizant of other democracies' politics. And unfortunately, I think that's where Washington really showed that it was amateur hour in the White House.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you make, Michael, about all the groups coalescing, because Indian democracy can be a little messy, a little noisy, as we all know. But yeah, that was one of those moments where even journalists who perhaps may not have taken nationalist tone did do that. I want to get to you next, Trisha. I mean, you worked on counterterrorism for years, both in policy planning at the highest echelons of state and now in academia, where you direct the policy anti-terrorism hub at American University, if I got that right. And obviously, Pakistan would be Disneyland when you're studying something like this, right? Because for the longest time, it's been both an enigma and very obvious, right? Enigma in the sense of how it's been able to get away with these raising the nefarious groups. And it's so obvious that where these groups receive the patronage from, like the Jaish-e-Mohammed, as Vikram mentioned, and Lashkar-e-Toiba. And, in recent interviews where you see former Foreign Minister Bilawal Bhutto, whose mother and grandfather were prime ministers, and Defense Minister Khwaja Asif, they keep on saying, but these groups, but it's not our fault. They go back to the days of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, when Washington did rely on the ISI and the mill establishment to train the Mujahideen. So when, to quote the Charlie Wilson war era, when the US was on the first bus out, in some ways, what did Washington think was going to happen? Because these are not going to be the good Samaritans who raise schools, college, orphanages. They'll coalesce and become groups like this. So, in some ways, as we talk about history, we have to speak about foreign policy failures as well, and how much of it is not Pakistan's fault, and how much of it is mostly Pakistan's fault.
I think that that's a really central point that is not one that you would hear in Washington. The anti-Soviet campaign in Afghanistan in the 1980s is not pointed to as some kind of policy failure. It is viewed as a very successful use of proxy warfare, which comes with pitfalls to it. That's, there are these kinds of issues with managing the agents when you're the principal in these kinds of conflicts. But it started off as simply an effort to bleed the Soviet Union and ended with its withdrawal and defeat, and then, of course, subsequently its collapse. So I think in Washington, that's still viewed largely as a success. And it is an example of how Pakistan, how ISI can be a useful partner for the United States in very specific ways, in ways that have other implications. And in that case, I think it is lazy analysis to conclude that those groups are the result of the US supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. There were certainly Pakistanis who mobilized in a desire to support the Mujahideen that was very much supported by the Pakistani state, especially under Zia-ul-Haq. So that was very much coming from within Pakistan. And the formulation of those groups, who were inconsequential, let's be clear, in the insurgency in Afghanistan in the 1980s, they formed in part because of that. Many contemporary Sunni militant groups do trace their roots back to that conflict, which was highly symbolic in a variety of ways. But it was, of course, the subsequent nurturing, institutionalization, and support of those groups that have made them what they are today. They did not thrive in the civil war and the collapse of the Afghan state that followed the Soviet withdrawal. They flourished within Pakistan, and they flourished under the Pakistani army establishment. And post 9/11, we also see that same conundrum that the United States runs into with Pakistan, which is that it was the United States' most important counterterrorism partner in diminishing and countering al-Qaeda. At the same time, it was working directly against US interests in supporting the Taliban and anti-India groups. This is the conundrum of a partnership with Pakistan, and the US has not been able to reconcile these issues. And I would say post-2021, that explains a lot of Washington's distance from Pakistan. There is anger, there is resentment at the Pakistanis' double game in Afghanistan. But it is actually, if anyone is reaping what they sow, you could argue that it is in fact Pakistan, because now they have an Afghan Taliban that is, I think you could argue, almost hostile to Pakistan at this point in its support for Tariqi Taliban Pakistan, escalation of violence, in its warm relations with India. So I don't think that there is a view in Washington by either administration or CT officials that the US is reaping what it has sowed, but there is some sense that Pakistan might be reaping what it sowed in terms of its policy vis-a-vis Afghanistan.
Yeah, absolutely. The chickens do come home to roost. And I think everyone remembers when Ronald Reagan had some of the Mujahideen warlords in the Oval Office and called them the equivalent of founding fathers. And I remember Pakistani academics said which one's Washington, which one's Jefferson, which one's Franklin. Vikram, this is actually funny because
one thing on that, I would say to Trisha's point about Pakistan reaping what it has sown. I mean, I think it is important to note Pakistan's on its 25th IMF bailout, which is a little bit ironic. The world's coming to the rescue of a country that has effectively self-sabotaged over the last quarter century. Pakistan had a per capita GDP higher than India or Bangladesh 25 years ago, and it is not sustainable. And I actually think it is a function of being a militarized society. In both Bangladesh and India, you've ended up with civilian-led governments, more or less democratic. In Bangladesh, you can argue it got quite autocratic and led to the recent political transition and crisis there. But it was civilian-led, and thus it wasn't bleeding the the state in quite the way that a military-dominated Pakistan has sort of squandered its own inherent resources and economic strengths by letting these sort of groups flourish and letting the economy be hijacked by a lot of special interests.
And I would
Yeah.
just like to add one more point to
Please.
that, which is that Pakistan's use of non-state proxies was not a product of the insurgency in Afghanistan. It started to use that tactic immediately after partition. It did help ISI to be a more effective organizer and manager of these proxy groups. I will concede that, but it is worth remembering that this was part of the playbook from day one. And that's why it's been so resilient and why we still see it today.
Yeah.
And I would just add 2 points, if I may. First of all, to what
Please.
Tricia said, absolutely, but it also got a shot of adrenaline after 1971 because the Pakistanis, look, their biggest fear is the lack of legitimacy inside Pakistan itself, a lack of nationalist vision. The fact of the matter is they use a religious ideology to cover up the ethnic identity, which they're afraid is going to tear the country apart. But the other issue, talking about this conversation which we just had with regard to Pakistan being an ally of the United States, working against the United States or its neighbors by proxy, we have another historical example here, not necessarily military dominated, but the United States has always been a partner with Israel. At the same time, throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, we were a partner with Saudi Arabia. The two countries were at loggerheads. They remained our partners. How did we ultimately square that circle? We didn't create some sort of moral compromise. Ultimately, what happened is Saudi Arabia realized, not after 9/11, but after the compound bombings of 2003, 2004, that the wildfire they had started and fueled was coming back to strike them, and they had top-down reform then. The problem with Pakistan right now is they're not willing to admit that they are the ones who set the wildfire, which now burns out of control in Pakistan. And so we don't have the top-down reform which they need.
Yeah, it's exactly what Hillary Clinton said when she was Secretary of State. You can't keep snakes in your backyard and expect they'll only bite your neighbors. They get out of control. And Vikram, economists sort of forecast, and it's harder doing it as a political scientist sometimes because it's hard to crystal ball gaze. But, Stephen Cohen, one of the godfathers of scholarly work in South Asia, bless his soul, wherever it is, wrote Shooting for a Century about this conundrum of India and Pakistan locked as intractable conflict. And we're almost there at 8 decades. And you just think about it from partition to Pahalgam. It's what I like to call Michael McFaul's title, not exactly Cold War, but hot peace. Like even when there is peace, it's kind of just, between two main events. You saw Prime Minister Vajpayee take the bus to Lahore, got the Kargil War. You saw military dictator Musharraf, the architect of the Kargil War, come for Agra summit, then the parliament attacks. And then you had 26/11 and then Pathankot, Uri, Pulwama and Pahalgam. So in some ways, it's the geopolitical fate of the military state. So as we talk about U.S. India becoming, this partnership, the fact is the United States has always had two moats on either side and the neighborhood, and India has two nuclear adversaries. Is that going to be a detriment in India's long-term thing about economic growth and aspirations, given that this cyclical nature of violence, maybe once every 4 or 5 years, seems to keep erupting?
I mean, one of the paradoxes for India is that India has a lot more to lose, right? I mean, India is surging ahead, becoming on its way to becoming the world's third largest economy, with sort of endless possibilities. And one of the worst things for endless possibilities is persistent conflict and fear of instability or terrorism. And so, it's in India's interest for this to be stabilized. And over the years, those forays you mentioned, including Prime Minister Modi in the beginning of his first term, doing very proactive engagement with and trying to get things going with Pakistani counterparts, and then feeling betrayed when that was followed with attacks. I think we've seen over the years that political progress leads to militant responses to disrupt that political progress, not unlike Hamas's fateful decision to say, my gosh, this place is getting too close to deals and the Saudis might normalize and we better blow it all up, which they did on October 7th. You see that playing out over and over again on the subcontinent, where when it looks like there might be some progress, the back channel's getting good, the prime minister drops in on the wedding of other prime ministers' kids, whatever. Like those sorts of things happen. Cricket diplomacy, back channels are active. You know, those happen, and then they tend to get disrupted by extremists. This, again, though, goes back. You just can't. There's no other explanation than Pakistan's continued tolerance and support of these extremist groups. I mean, they are given the ability to disrupt the political progress that the whole subcontinent needs to actually advance to live up to its potential. And you know, at some point we have to get to a period where, like Michael said, leaders within Pakistan decide that they have to make a change the way leaders in Saudi decided they needed to make a change, that we've got to deal with the snakes in our own backyard, as you were saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to get to you next, Michael, on that note as well. I mean, just before we were discussing about, what this is now, I want to say global conflict, but there's certainly a global procurement battle. The fighter jets were Chinese, French made, Russian and American. And, and we saw now an era of AI and automated weapons. You saw drones used from Israel, which has one of the leading drone technology. And of course, Pakistan fired a lot of Turkish drones into Indian airspace targeting Indian military installments. So the future of defense procurement and defense partnership has become all the more important, and in some ways all the more murky. Depends on what you're, selling to, who buys, and what they use it for.
Absolutely. Look, there's 2 points I want to make. One is with regard to the United States, that, as you know, I served in the George W. Bush administration, and I was there against the backdrop of the Iraq War and so forth. And one of the criticisms, put aside the diplomatic and political criticism of U.S. policy at the time, one of the military criticisms, especially of Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, is that the United States is always preparing to fight the previous war. So Rumsfeld was so obsessed with so-called fourth generation warfare and so forth that we ultimately went into Iraq in a way where we weren't actually prepared for the fight that we were going to have to engage in. Now, when I look at what happened with India and Pakistan, the fact of the matter is, this showed that over the last several years, India has been doing its homework. Pakistan to a lesser extent. And India has shown that they have understood that they can't simply fight as in the past, that they need to be proactive. Now, I'm also reminded of 2 other examples, and then I'll get to the procurement. One is, of course, Russia and Ukraine, and the other is Azerbaijan and Armenia. And in 2020, I was in Nagorno-Karabakh less than 2 weeks after the guns fell silent. Now, when Russia invaded Ukraine, Putin thought it was going to be a 2-day or at most 2-week war. And he didn't understand how the Ukrainians were going to fight, but he hasn't reformed his military. Anyone who's just reformed ends up defenestrated or falling down the stairs or what have you. In Armenia, after the 2020 loss, where the Armenian defense minister downplayed the importance of drones, he ultimately was arrested and imprisoned on issues relating to corruption and negligence and so forth. So Armenia held people to account after this. It's curious to see whether Pakistan is going to hold Asim Munir to account. But then when we get to the actual foreign procurement, you're absolutely right. And this is what military analysts and potential customers across the globe are now looking at. They're looking at how the Rafale performed. They're looking at how the Chinese jets performed. They're looking at the shine being taken off of the Turkish drones. Now, anyone who's been following the Turkish drones has seen this trend for some time. But I guarantee you that the Turks are going to lose hundreds of millions of dollars in African contracts, having seen how poorly the Turkish drones now perform. And when I'm in Central Africa, I spend a lot of time in the DRC and so forth. When I talk to military analysts, it's an open secret that it's possible to hijack drones, that the Turkish drones aren't what they were just a few years ago. But this is also a point where India can truly shine in the coming years, because just like, look, I grew up with a TRS-80 computer and a Commodore 64 and then an Apple II, Apple II Plus. And I remember that how rapidly the generations of computers change. We're at the same place with military technology. India has not only the brain power, because frankly, Pakistan does as well, but India has the industrial base in order to really maintain its lead and continue to innovate. Unfortunately, one of the other aspects of the Pakistani military, and we see something similar in Egypt, for example, is the corrupting nature, the stifling, suffocating nature of the military on industry. And that's something where I think also looking forward, it's not just who's flying a Turkish drone or an Israeli drone. Who has the industrial base that's going to be free to flourish and innovate, and whose industrial base is going to be suffocated by corruption, by military interests, or by politics.
No, absolutely. And I think that's the good, interesting point there about Turkish drones in Central African countries, Michael. That's really given us more research to look at. Trisha, when Prime Minister Modi met President Trump on a very cold, snowy day in February this year, one of the surprising elements that came out from the joint statement was when President Trump also announced the extradition of Taur Rana. He was an accomplice of one of the masterminds, Pakistani American David Coleman Headley, one of the main conspirators of the 26/11 attack. And that's what's been codified as India's 9/11. Went over 3 days and really etched in the mind as 10 gunmen held Mumbai hostage. And while the US and India inked an extradition treaty in 1997, in a Washington that's looking a little more isolationist on foreign policy on the world stage, can it really afford to be, given the pernicious threats today we face with AI and autonomous weapons, and many rogue non-state actors can fall into hands of these weaponry, as Michael alluded to in previously. It's very easy for these things to be hijacked. So can Washington afford to be isolationist right now?
I think there's a couple really interesting points in what you just laid out. The first is the extradition of Rana. My understanding of that is it was much more the culmination of a legal process in the United States than sort of a specific to this administration. And I think in that way, it was a good proof of concept that this process, this legal process, can produce these kinds of extraditions and this kind of counterterrorism cooperation. In fact, I think the maybe more interesting action that's occurred under the Trump administration has been its decision to deport an individual who is a supporter of Khalistan who'd entered the United States illegally. And so I think there are ways in which the Trump administration's immigration agenda can dovetail with some of India's counterterrorism concerns. I think overall, what we're seeing in terms of the more isolationist posture that you mentioned is the US can do it, right? It's possible to do it, to take this more isolationist, more transactionalist approach. I don't think it is the best way for the US to leverage its position in the international system, contain the competition from China, to contain Russia's revisionism. So I think it is possible to do it, but I fundamentally think it is not the best approach from a counterterrorism perspective or a broader foreign policy perspective. And one of the things that is clear is with the rise of strategic competition, counterterrorism cooperation has gotten harder. There was a time where the US could find space to cooperate on counterterrorism with states it had otherwise very difficult relationships with. And that has gotten more and more difficult. And I think that dovetails with your point about the increasing sophistication of violent non-state actors and their ability to access these technologies. I think overall, the international system is less able to counter these kinds of actors because counterterrorism cooperation has been reduced as a priority and has become sort of bogged down in the broader strategic competition that's really dominating in the international environment, coupled with this more transactional, isolationist, and even revisionist approach of the Trump administration.
Yeah, absolutely. And the good thing about, Trisha, your line of work is the fact that terror threats are more nebulous because they're not exactly isolated to borders and state governments and certain foreign policy and military machinery. And Vikram, you worked at highest echelons of policy planning as well in the Defense Department as well as its state, and you've dealt with a lot of your Indian counterparts then. And what is interesting about this particular standoff was, when we saw the Kargil conflict in '99, India didn't cross the LOC, even though it was a conventional warfare and India lost lives. The surgical strikes post Uri, India crossed the LOC, Balakot, India crossed the international borders, and now with Pahalgam, India kind of hit deeper into Pakistan than it had since 1971. So is the era of restraint that we spoke about, Shiv Shankar Menon, who was, I think, the NSA at that time in 2008 during the Bombay attacks, in his book about Indian foreign policy planning, spoke about restraint and why India didn't go to war with Pakistan at 2008. Has that now gone? The specter of conflict has just been raised to a new level altogether.
Well, I mean, I think the the most important thing in Prime Minister Modi's speech was probably his saying that India will not bend to nuclear blackmail. The view had been in the era of restraint that in a nuclear shadow, you weren't going to go escalate from an unconventional attack to a conventional attack because you'd worry about stepping on that first rung of an escalatory ladder, and you would sort of say, we will take the high road and we will respond, but it'll be counterterrorism type responses, legal responses, diplomatic responses, political responses, get pressure on the country. And I think that, that approach, I think, was not bearing fruit because we had the persistence of this set of challenges. And so what I do think you're seeing, though, is a very calibrated escalation, both tactically in one given incident and strategically over time, right? So this response takes a step up from the last time. But within this response, I think it is important to unpack what actually happened. Like the Indians took their time, and then they very much responded to just hitting terrorist infrastructure on the first day of this little 4-day escapade. And what I think was very interesting there is that's probably in part why they seem to have suffered some aircraft losses. They threw up a lot of fourth generation fighters into contested airspace, and they took no action against military targets. So they weren't really suppressing, and maybe it also exposes insufficient electronic warfare capabilities for the Indians. It's something to think about. But it's very interesting because I think Pakistan had a very easy exit at that point. Whether we'll learn what really happened, but the Pakistani claim of we shot down 5 Indian fighters would have been a way to say, you did this, but look at the cost we can impose on you. Be careful, watch out, don't do it again. Pakistan's choice to respond was the next escalation. And I think, in these sorts of tit for tat situations, each side tries to act as if the other side started it. But if we accept the premise that the terrorist attack is where this starts, then India did a very calibrated set of tactical responses. And the outcome, which might have looked more favorable to Pakistan had they taken an exit on day one, looked far less favorable by Saturday, when India had effectively hit 11 military installations in Pakistan, clearly doing less damage than it could have. And Pakistan had failed to inflict much damage at all with its waves of attacks that targeted Indian, both not just military infrastructure, but also cultural sites. And I think the Pakistanis got a little too clever here. And I do think, there should be accountability within Pakistan for this. This is not ultimately a good outcome. But like Michael said, I don't know that we would see that.
Yeah, and I wanted to get. Yeah, please, Michael, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to jump in with an analogy, which also I think colors this, and that's with Israel's counterterrorism policy, specifically with regard to Gaza and Hamas over the years. The Israelis often talked about mowing the grass because they understood that a full-scale war with Hamas, as we've seen for the last 2+ years, or the last 2 years, would be extract a huge cost. So whenever there would be an attack, they would calibrate a response, maybe take out some bomb-making factories, maybe go after a terror cell, and they nicknamed it mowing the grass. The problem is, and then once you mow the grass, you have a couple months or a couple years before you need to do it again. The problem is on October 7th, what was demonstrated from an Israeli point of view was that we can't afford to mow the grass anymore. We need to uproot the lawn. And given how just the sheer atrocity of the Pahalgam attack and the shock of separating Hindu men and executing them in front of their families, I mean, in many ways, I wonder whether that shock, and Vikram had said at the very beginning, made an analogy to how this played in India, similar to how October 7th played in Israel. That I think perhaps Israel and India are both learning similar counter-terror lessons about the utility of kicking the can down the road, especially coming to the recognition that sometimes that road simply ends.
Yeah, and Michael, actually, that was going to be some of my next question, and that's the beauty about webinars like this with so many expertise. Like, you almost, it just seamlessly flows. And because given your years of covering Middle East or West Asia, as we say in India, there's this convergence between the U.S. and India right now in that part of the world. Since 2023, we saw, the India Middle East Economic Corridor announced at the G20. There's been the I2U2 announced in 2021. But also since 2023, some of the tensions you touched on as well, Israel and Iran got into direct conflicts, which they hadn't. It was always just proxy warfare for the longest time. And we saw the deteriorating situation in Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria, and also create supply chain bottlenecks along the Suez Road, disrupted because of the Houthis. So right now, when we talk, I asked Trisha before, but what Washington needs to know, because companies were a little apprehensive about initially with the IMEC, given the situation in 2023. Now it's coming to the party. What should Washington policymakers and perhaps the private sector really understand right now with regards to subcontinent right now, even though as temperatures are starting to dial down? What do you think, both the commercial and the private sector, as well as policymakers, really understand this right now to get ahead of the game?
Well, I mean, ultimately, the question is asked and answered. We see how important India is. My advice to American policymakers is not to be constrained by the artificial constraints of our own bureaucratic geography. So, look, I'm a Middle East specialist by training, an Iran specialist. But since the United States tends to focus on West Asia more, when the Houthi threat erupts, we look at it in terms of, oh, the Houthis are reacting towards the Israel-Gaza fight. That's why they're interfering with freedom of navigation in the Red Sea. But from an Indian perspective, I don't think it's a coincidence that just a month after the G20 summit with IMEC being announced, we have suddenly an interference with international shipping going through the Bab el-Mandeb. Remember, IMEC would go from India across the northern Indian Ocean to the Emirates, across Saudi Arabia to Israel, and then to the Eastern Mediterranean. What it was bypassing was the north-south corridor. Now, in Iran, in the United States, I should say, we think about the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terror group. And I'm fully invested in that view. I consider it a terror group. But from an Iranian point of view, it is an economic force that the revenue from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and their logistical and economic wing called Khatam al-Anbiya is easily about 6 or 7 times their official budget. The point of this is, from a Revolutionary Guard point of view, they saw India bypassing trade, which the Revolutionary Guard stood to profit by. So the Revolutionary Guard is trying to shut down the Bab el-Mandeb trade in order to force things to transit Iran, which the Revolutionary Guard could profit from. The point of this is that the world is complex. When it comes to Iranian behavior and that of their proxies, they're often trying to kill multiple birds with one stone. And we need to understand, when we're looking at an issue, nothing is simply cut and dry. We may look at it as black and white, but there's usually multiple games being played out. And so we do need to listen to the concerns of partners in countries like India, rather than simply say, because everyone in the US State Department who works on West Asia everyone who works on Iran, everyone who works in the Pentagon on these issues is constrained to a vision that doesn't normally include South Asia, doesn't mean that South Asia doesn't exist. So we really need to do better in Washington at spanning these artificial bureaucratic constraints that the State Department and the Pentagon, and for that matter, the Central Intelligence Agency, have drawn.
No, absolutely. And Michael, I want to get to you, Trisha, before we open up to audience questions. It was actually fascinating because I was thinking about what we read right now was Evan Gersovich, the Wall Street Journal, wrongly detained in Moscow on false charges of espionage. Has become a household name. But going back 2 decades ago or 2.5 decades ago, the ghosts of Daniel Pearl still very much linger in the subcontinent. The former South Asia bureau chief was lured in when he was reporting in Karachi and then brutally murdered. And one of the things that came out from Operation Sindoor was there was long justice delivered not just to the victims of the Pahalgam attack, but even for Daniel Pearl. Apparently, the precision strikes reportedly eliminated many terrorists, including one Abdul Rauf Azhar, the cousin, I think, of Maulana Masood Azhar, a key figure who was released for the hostages of IC-814 in 1999. And of course, from New Delhi's perspective, there's also Washington and the West to really look at, this as some sort of justice for the family of Daniel Pearl. And perhaps some of the commentary coming from Delhi was we need to stop this both sidism argument, given there is one aggressor using proxies and one, being a victim of terrorism.
I think there's a couple really important points I'd like to touch on in response to that. I think this is a reminder of the consequences of negotiating with terrorists for hostage releases. There's a long shadow to such decisions, and this is one example of it. To your point, I think that the main outcome that I see from a counterterrorism perspective of Operation Sindoor it was justice. Right? It was, of course, there was a domestic political component to it, but the main thing it accomplished was some semblance of justice against individuals in both Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed who have engaged in terrorism against India. There's also been an element of that justice in the targeted killing campaign that India's been undertaking in Pakistan and elsewhere. But what I want to be also I don't want to be sanguine about this. It has not established deterrence and it has not weakened these organizations significantly. These are organizations that are much too deep in their benches, much too sophisticated, much too institutionalized to be seriously damaged by a few counterterrorism strikes. So I think there is a lot of merit in justice. I'm a big fan of it myself as a counterterrorism practitioner and scholar, but I also want to be clear about what it has not accomplished. And we've talked about the analogy with Israel, and I think that was an important Israeli lesson that deterrence is not easy to establish if it's possible to establish it at all. And it thought it had established it, and it turned out that it did not. And there's also an important difference when we talk about the Iran proxy network and Pakistan's proxies, and that is that Pakistan's proxies live under the Pakistani state. So there is no way to go after them that does not simultaneously go after the Pakistani state. There's just that overlap is much more pronounced. There's no way to conduct a Israeli like operation against Hezbollah that is not simultaneously hitting the Pakistani state. And in Lebanon doesn't have nuclear weapons, and Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. So this is there are useful comparisons between the two, but there's also, I think, some important differences that we need to make sure that we're keeping in mind and understanding what can be accomplished. And so, as I say, I think there was a strong element of justice, and that's undoubtedly merited and satisfying, but I also want to be very clear about the limits of what was accomplished here in terms of weakening these organizations or deterring the future use of terrorism.
Yeah, and it's important to caveat that Pakistan is a country of 250 million people and one of 7th or 8th largest army. And as the military would keep saying, they are a nuclear weapon state, even though it's safe. But so it's not easy just to, as some Indian nationalist news channels that finish them off. We can't finish off all these terror groups that receive patronage. And I want to get some audience questions. Robin Walker asks, can we talk about the challenges of integrating the different systems, as well as the value in sharing some of the ISR data from the crisis with potential defense supplies and partners? So Vikram, Michael, Trisha, Feel free to jump in.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a second question that's also on satellites and
Yeah,
data sharing. I mean,
yeah, combine them.
the U.S., post 2008, a lot of counterterrorism data sharing, and then post Galvan, a lot of real-time information sharing, which I assume, I can't confirm, but I assume the information sharing channels, including US satellite data, probably continued to India through this crisis. I don't think it's been talked about publicly, but there's no reason for me to think what has become very routine sharing of information. It's gone from, in my day, if we wanted to share information, somebody was having to like print things out and carry it physically over, and like to an actual integrated system where, because we've signed all these fundamental agreements, from the GSOMIA, which is the geospatial intelligence sharing thing, through our various security documents and CAPSA communication stuff. All these things have been done. So the underlying infrastructure for cooperating on intelligence is in place with India. So I think they would have gotten information from the United States through this. I mean, one thing that's clear is the U.S. always said the Indians had a right to respond. If anything, they said, you need to maybe be careful or calibrate or watch out for escalatory risks. But I think the lesson out of this will be more integration is better, more capacity is better. Sovereign assets plus commercial assets are now both tools that can be used. And that, you look, that the Pakistanis do seem to have been able to benefit from Chinese systems and presumably from Chinese satellite data, which I think they would have access to with these aircraft and platforms for their intelligence and their targeting. So I think there's a bit of a race on too. And for India to keep up in that race, I do believe it needs to work not just with its most established defense partners, who are the United States is one of them, but the biggest are sort of Israel, France, and Russia. I think it really will take a lot more proactive cooperation for India to keep up, and with the assumption being that China and Pakistan will continue to help one another, and that China will continue to help Pakistan, and China will continue to probably view trouble between India and Pakistan as beneficial, in the sense that it helps China have India bogged down by trouble on the other side.
Vikram, this is part about Quad as well in that question. Now, with ISRO planning to launch 150 plus satellites to enhance real-time military and border intelligence, the scope within the Quad, and we talk a lot about maritime domain awareness, undersea cables. So this could come up in the next Quad Leader Summit, should the date be fructified soon.
So the Quad already has a maritime domain awareness initiative, which is using commercial data and sharing it with allies and partners around the region, which has now been fulfilled in multiple locations. The Indians, Japanese, Australians, Americans, all participating in sharing commercially available radio frequency data with partners throughout the region. The Quad could do a lot more, and it could be a lot more focused on the kinds of threats we see from both extremist groups, and from the Chinese, but also transnational criminal organizations, smugglers, drug traffickers. There's a whole bunch of areas in which the Quad could deepen its cooperation in those areas. Absolutely.
Yeah. Trisha, Michael, maybe you guys want to weigh in on the next one. They said, given Pakistan's ongoing support for terrorist networks and considering that the president has full authority to revoke major non-NATO ally status via executive order, as was done with Afghanistan in 2022, why hasn't this outdated designation been rescinded? If I remember 2018, I think on Jan 1, perhaps something in the PDB, President Trump tweeted about Pakistan and terror networks right straight off the bat. And I think one would argue, since Bombay 2008 and Bin Laden in 2011, that relationship has sort of just, it's almost ally, but with friends like these. So why hasn't anything been done from Washington's perspective, as our guests ask?
Trisha?
I think nothing has been done on this, mostly because of inertia, not because there's some kind of major decision point that we should keep this. Having said that, I think this is one of those levers that can be brought to bear in the aftermath of the terrorist attack. rather than just simply rescind it, which, to your point, the relationship really isn't at that level anymore. There is maybe still some symbolic power in the presence of that status that U.S. working with India could bring some of the demands that it wants Pakistan to undertake, with the idea that if those are not satisfied from a counterterrorism perspective, that will be one of the outcomes. This is a point of leverage that the Washington might be able to use to some effect, or at least it's worth trying to use it to some effect. I think the trick of that, what I've just proposed, though, is like, what are realistic demands that would restrain those groups, that would have some effect on their activities? Because frankly, I think some of the bigger asks, extradite Hafez, those are simply not going to happen. So if there is a desire to do that and to pull that declaration, sure, that is highly symbolic for something that will not happen. But there is ways to have more calibrated demands that the Pakistanis may actually be willing to undertake, that reduce their willingness and their ability for these groups to undertake violence, at least for the near term. And I know that's not satisfying, but what we've seen with Iran and Pakistan is it's very hard to get countries to completely dismantle this tool, especially when they are operating at a strategic disadvantage against their main adversary. And so I think the process of weaning Pakistan away from this policy, policy that it's had since partition, is definitely a long-term one that you need a lot of different policy tools. And still, the predictions of success should be modest. But I do think this is one of many policy levers that Washington could consider using at this time in support of some of India's counterterrorism demands.
And I would just add, look, I agree with Tricia and her explanation. I would go a little bit beyond inertia in a related way, in that the Trump administration is yet to really be fully staffed in any meaningful way. And those who are filling in on certain slots aren't going to be as proactive in pushing things forward. They're going to see themselves as managers more than policymakers. But I do want to add one thing, and I have no direct evidence for this, just the pattern. One answer to this that I worry about is with Qatar and other Gulf Arab countries, but specifically Qatar, throwing its weight around, throwing its money around, that perhaps there's a pattern in which Qatar will sometimes act to prevent consequence upon countries or regimes that use terrorism or embrace Islamism. And I would hope that that's not happening here, but it would behoove members of Congress in their oversight role to ensure that's the case. And I mean that in a bipartisan way.
Yeah. Just to
I'm curious, Michael, what you think, but it didn't seem like Pakistan got much support from partners, from friends in the Gulf. But I am curious what we think about that. I mean, I know that it sounds like the Saudis were involved in making calls to both sides, and obviously the Saudi-India partnership, the Emirati-India partnership have all deepened substantially over the years. But Pakistan normally looks to the Gulf for some backup.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not specifically thinking about the Saudis and the Emiratis. I'm specifically thinking about the Qataris, because you do have this development of a Qatari-Turkish axis out there, which is something which, I mean, ultimately, I think we need to be concerned about. The caveat also here is I don't want to engage in mindless Qatar bashing, because when you look at Qatar more deeply, perhaps the king of Qatar, the Sheikh, is a problem, but the Qatar isn't monolithic, and there are people within the Qatari bureaucracy who are not as sanguine about the direction which Qatar is going. That said, the nature of being an absolute monarchy is they don't have a say right now.
Yeah. Just to, and I think Vikram, on that point, I think with IMEC as well, there'll be closer ties with India and the GCC and the Levant countries, as well as new economic corridors of trust get built. To bring this to a close, so final question, and it was actually perhaps a more pertinent question, because So what was the rationale for the recent IMF bailout of Pakistan, knowing that much of the funding will likely be used, well, maybe will not be used well? Let me paraphrase that question. So perhaps, that's a good way to end this webinar. Why now, given the loans and bailouts should be with caveats, and clearly the caveats may not have been as present.
Trisha, you want to take that?
I am not privy to what the calculus was behind that IMF decision, so I will defer to you, Vikram.
I mean, I think there's two factors. One is it is in progress. I believe it was probably held up as at risk a little bit in the urgent ceasefire, like, hey, let's time to take an off ramp. And by the way, you've got $1 billion IMF loan that might have trouble. I think that probably was something that was factored into pushing Pakistan to take an off ramp. But I also think the simple fact is Pakistan is economically in really bad shape. And yeah, I mean, money is fungible, so people worry about what it'll be used for, but there are real needs in Pakistan, human needs that are problematic, largely because of the mismanagement and bad leadership that the Pakistanis have suffered under, for so many years. So I think that's part of it too. But like, I think if the ceasefire hadn't happened, I could imagine that the IMF next tranche would also have been held up. And I don't think that India is going to quietly sit by on future rounds of World Bank and IMF assistance with Pakistan. I think they're going to start using more and more tools. And we didn't even get to the abeyance of the Indus Waters Treaty, which I think India is basically implying it's going to take steps to restrict the flow of water to Pakistan too, again, in an effort to pressure Pakistan to deal with the terrorism issue.
As an analyst, I agree with Vikram. As an advocate, it frustrates me, and I see this in Ghana, I see this in other places that the IMF deals with, that when you have a compulsive gambler, you don't keep bailing them out. But I think there's another factor in why Washington allowed this to go through. And one of the drawbacks about having an administration that works more on that relies more upon individuals than upon a system is it's hard to be proactive. It's hard to get people's attention. And I think timing was also a factor, that the IMF meeting on May 9th happened so soon after this occurred that, simply put, neither Marco Rubio, who now has 4 portfolios, nor Donald Trump really had the bandwidth or the ability to get ahead of this meeting before the IMF just acted by rote the way the IMF always reacts. I'm more hopeful, and I think India should very much demand that this not happen again as the next $1 billion is considered, because this $1 billion was part of a $7 billion package, which is reviewed every year and given in trenches.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as Rick Rosso, one of our friends, would like to say, we reached the witching hour right now. And, Michael, Trisha, Vikram, we could go on all day, but because that's what you have when 3 sets of expertise come together for this. And this topic will, of course, shifting sands of South Asia. There's a lot more that's going to come out in the next few days. But Trisha, Michael, Vikram, thank you so much, for being here. And especially Michael and Trisha, your first time on the series. And I know it won't be the last. We'll get you many more, hopefully, on more pleasant topics sometimes. But thank you so much.
Congratulations again to Trisha on our full promotion to professor.
Yes,
you.
congratulations. You heard it first here on our webinars. So thanks
It was
again.
a pleasure to join you. Thanks for having
Thank you for everyone who joined
Shona.
us.
Thanks.
Thank you for the questions. And this will be available on our YouTube channel, and we'll share it on social media. So if you want to revisit that pearl of wisdom that Trisha, Michael, or Vikram have shared, please go visit it on our YouTube channel. Until next time, thank you as always. Have a great weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.